Here's a wiring diagram for the starter on my 52 Farmall M tractor. I've converted it to a push button ignition rather than the old mechanical ignition switch. Here's the push button ignition switch, and it goes to the starter solenoid, which then goes to the starter motor. At first it was a little tricky to understand that the ignition is receiving hot wire and sending hot wire. Also, the starter solenoid needs to be ground itself. So there's two wires coming off the battery. There's the main higher amp wire, positive, coming to the starter solenoid, and here's the lower amp hot wire coming to the ignition switch. The solenoid has two inputs, the S and the I. In my case, I didn't need anything on the ignition terminal, so I just ran directly from my starter and my push button to the solenoid. So the idea is pretty simple. This is the pass-through high amp to the starter motor. But then this is a switch here, and it receives this low amp voltage. And when it receives the positive on the S, connects this through. High amp runs the starter motor. This might be a neat trick for other robotic applications too, where you can turn with a low amp switch, you can turn on a high amp motor. So maybe there's some applications where this little switch, instead of a button ignition, you could have a RC servo or something, push this button, and then that turns this on, and then that would run a larger motor. So you can control a large motor off of a small RC servo motor. So that might come in handy during robotics. But in this case, this is just our traditional old school 1950s starter motor wiring. This is the starter motor, or the starter solenoid I bought at like Auto World or something like that, about $9. Pretty reasonable price. Here's the motor. So this is our line coming in, our high amp positive, passing through and passing the high amp out to the starter motor. This is the starter motor off of the 1952 Farmall M. In the real world application, this would be mounted to the body of the vehicle, so this would already be ground. In this case, I had to run an extra wire to the negative terminal of the battery to ground it. But other than that, this is basically the setup. So with the motor grounded to the negative in the battery, then you can turn the starter motor on with a simple push of the ignition switch. There's your starter motor right there. Simple push of the starter button ignition. Controls the servo, turns the motor on. Here's our circuitry one more time. I'll spend a little more time looking at this really cool starter servo. And that's the way it's set up. Here's the mounting bracket right here. This is the solenoid. Again, I got it Valucraft. This is, I think, off the shelf, 12 volt for the old Ford pre-1970, I believe. Back when the starter motors and the solenoid were separate units, just like I have on my tractor.